not as pessimistic as you about reform of the UN. I completely agree with you, it's absolutely necessary. And having sat in the UN and watched what happens and participated in conversations there, it's pretty grim. You're quite right. The Security Council is a complete disaster. The veto is unhelpful. The permanent members, the P5, are unhelpful. The rotating members need to be thought of better. And there is quite a lot of push for reform from the inside. I'm not prepared to write that off. Again, for ethical foreign policy, I think it depends on the ethical stance of a party in government. And again, that's something I wouldn't be doing. I don't believe as an activist or as somebody trying to get into politics that you believe nothing is possible. I've spent my whole life working, as I'm sure like most people in this room, for the world to be a better place. And if we didn't believe it could be that, then we wouldn't bother. So I'm not prepared to give up on these at all. What was 2003? I'm less convinced than you that the task that was intended in the war was to establish vulnerable governments. I think it was to establish puppet governments more than vulnerable ones. Those that are actually...
I said dysfunctional governments.
All right, okay. I think the task has been to establish an instability and governments that are compliant to the wishes of the NATO allies and others who are powerful in geopolitics. Yes, and I've got questions muddled up. Yes, with refugees, somebody asked about refugees, or that you said much rather stay where they were. Of course, that's the point I was making about Purna. I've done a lot of the project that Jeremy mentioned was with refugees, including from Iraq in 1991 when I was doing that work. Refugees leave because they have to, not because they want to. That is the whole point. It's what refugees means. Being a refugee means. So, of course, that's what they want to do. And our task internationally is to ensure that people can be safe wherever they live, not that they have to leave for safety. If they leave, then we have to offer safety elsewhere. That's what the international asylum system is about. What have I missed? I don't know if Ed Miliband said he was a Zionist. I don't know if he said that. Did he say that?
He said he was a friend of Israel.
He said what?
I think he said he was a friend of Israel.
Yeah.
But then he also made a statement on Gaza.
Okay. Okay, so there's a little disagreement in terms of what he said, so I'm a little cautious about jumping in there in terms of what it means. I think in terms of, what was the last question? Oh, you asked me a whole load of questions. Trident, I'm opposed. Spending, what was the second question? Spending? Nuclear war, nuclear weapons, opposed to it. And I don't really understand the question on international relations and conflict, except that I'm opposed. I don't know what the question means other than that, sorry.
What about the issue of Trident? Are you for or
No, I said I'm opposed.
Sorry?
I said I'm opposed.
You're opposed.
That was pretty clear. I heard that. I only said that twice.
You omitted actually what I said.
Which one?
You seek apologies or even recognition of the failure of policy in the of 2003.
With particular reference to the people who are still in leading positions in the party.
My reservation about, this is my point at the beginning, don't just pick one country or another. Look, I was in Rwanda, where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. And I think there's all sorts of reparations and apologies that need to be thought about. So I'm really cautious about picking one up and saying, do this, and ignore the rest. There are people waiting for justice all over the world, and I'm very reluctant to prioritise one over another because they get forgotten. I've been there, I've seen what it's like, I've seen how frightened they are, I've seen women whose limbs were hacked off, I've seen orphans, HIV orphans. There are child soldiers, there are children working in brick factories all over the world. I'm really, really uncomfortable about saying this is the issue now, this is all we can ever talk about. Once we fix this, we'll be happy. There's a much bigger, more complicated project to take on.
Let me bring Joy in to comment on the questions that have been asked so far, and then we'll come back after you.
Thank you. These mics I don't need a mic, hopefully. I'm impressed with Purna's responses to the questions and her contribution. Just to clear the air, I really do hope that she has your support in the election. And I'm not in Brighton Pavilion, but I really think that it is impressive to be on this panel with Purna and with Jeremy. And these are people that give us an opportunity to debate and to support policies that it looks as though we're all in agreement. On the questions that you've raised, we do need an ethical foreign policy. We do need to stop the arms trade. And Jeremy mentioned the horrendous fact that Saudi Arabia has export licenses for billions of pounds, and they haven't been stopped. It is about time we threw out those people in the Labour Party who want war. Jeff Hoon has gone, and Patricia Hewitt, if you remember, there was a scandal about them selling advantages to people who would like introductions to military or civil contracts. But Jack Straw is still there. He's leaving Parliament, but he has a lot to answer for. He himself, with Blair, spoke for the transportation of innocent people to Guantanamo. And we have always to bring him to account, and Blair, because they hold a lot of responsibility for what happened in the support for Bush. In fact, if the UK had stood against Bush, there would not have been the war against Iraq. Saddam Hussein was supposed to have supported Al-Qaeda, which he didn't, and that he had nuclear weapons that he would give to bin Laden, a total lie. He hadn't got weapons of mass destruction. He was only using a sort of an opportunity to act on the world stage. He was a dictator, and we cannot forgive Halabja and what happened to the Kurds. But what they're trying to do now is to make sure it's a failed state and a divided state. And so they have supported the Kurds against the government, and the government of Maliki supported only the Shias and marginalised the Sunnis, and the Sunnis themselves had lost their status, lost everything when the de-Ba'athization by the US, a complete mistake, and we're carrying on and continuing to devastate that country and to support the way in which this country does not even, and America, they are in two ways. They're going to oppose ISIS with Jay Stewart, but also to the object of the exercise is to make sure that the Middle East is devastated, and particularly Syria. And their object in the end is Iran. So who knows? We have to realise what they're doing, and they're doing it for power, for strategic interests. And Jack Straw and, in the background, Tony Blair are still there pulling the strings. And of course we have to support the Palestinian struggle. And regarding Ed Miliband, one thing I remember about Ed Miliband, he did not say anything against the attack by the Israelis against the Palestinians. But he said, Cameron, you haven't said anything about the attack. He himself said nothing. Miliband, as usual, lets us down and said nothing. I don't think he is as a Zionist. I think he has family connections with in Israel, and I expect he has his own reasons for his silence. But we do want people that really stand up for civil rights, civil liberties, and against war, and against intervention, and against what is happening now. So I absolutely agree. Ed Miliband and the rest need to change or go. Democracy, always said that anyway. We just want to carry on to stop interventions and create peace. I had something about the Labour Party which I'd like to sum up later on. Thank you.
Okay, well,
Issues. First of all, Scotland, I think one thing that if the Labour Party had a policy of scrapping Trident and not sending UK soldiers to be killed abroad, then I don't think Scotland would be that concerned about independence. On other issues, obviously, they would. But the Labour Party in Scotland is in a mess. They've been in a mess for a very long time. And talk about Ed Miliband, he couldn't even remember the name of the Scottish leader that they just elected recently. However, let's not give Ed Miliband a bad press. He certainly needs our support if we're going to have a Labour government. And let's hope with our support there will be much more movement on the issues that we're concerned with. On detention centres, well, there isn't enough protest. It is outrageous that people are put in detention centres without any rights. Can hardly see a lawyer. Lawyers go in pro bono to help them. And then they're extradited. And some of them have died in the process. It is a scandal that we place people in detention centres in denial of all their rights. And we must use that opportunity. And I know in Brighton there's a very strong protest against the detention centre in Gatwick. And if anyone has the time to support them, and they do go there weekly to give support to people who are there in detention through no fault of their own. Ian Paisley, it was amazing to hear that Martin McGuinness gave the biggest tribute about Ian Paisley. And he became not Dr. No, but Dr. Yes. And that was wonderful. And like you say, if we can resolve a conflict that seemed not to be able to be resolved, where their hatred continued and still possibly is still there in some minds, but people wanted peace. They wanted peace above all, and people came out on the streets and protested. Despite Bloody Sunday, despite all the people who died in that conflict. And let's support that cause for peace. And Ian Paisley, amazingly, I think he had a heart attack, or he had a change of mind, literally had a heart attack in the hospital, and had a change of mind. And he did support the peace process. Difficult, although it has been and still is. Was there anything else that I missed out? Obviously, the poor. We are all seeing things that we never saw before. Food banks, people dying, people committing suicide because of their desperation not to have a job and not to have enough money to feed their family, and the bedroom tax. People have taken their lives because of the bedroom tax. And we have to put this government, make them accountable for what they've done and the austerity that we know they have put in place against the poor, against all of us, because all of us know people who are suffering, and all of us have suffered. So it is important to keep our anger and to keep our protest and to support those people like Jeremy, like Purna, who are working hard to create a better Labour Party. I had some things about Labour C&D, and I seem to have forgotten to tell you, just quickly, if I may, at the end.
I should certainly come back to some concluding remarks. Purna, what would you like to add at this point?
I agree, intervention hasn't helped. Who else? That was that Fran. Yeah. Interventions I would often characterise them as adventures rather than interventions, and the legacy of the colonialism that we see in the neo-imperialism today that really, really does need to be properly addressed and ended. The line has to lie with the land. I find it very difficult, as I say, to talk to some of the people I've had to talk to, but you have to do it. You don't move on with that. I'm talking about Ian Paisley is illustrative of that, but South Africa is a huge example too. What happened there is truly stunning, and it takes very, very hard work. No, I don't believe that getting justice for the poor here would fix things in Uganda. Uganda has a very different context. The LRA and its legacy is poisonous and pernicious. Having a person in charge for 30 years who keeps changing the constitution so he can stay in charge is not going to be fixed by us dealing justice to our poor. Those things do not just fall into place. It's not a domino effect. They're different struggles, and they have to be linked. And those who are fighting here for the poor and the marginalised and the disabled and the single mums and the kids who haven't got VMA have to fight those battles, but also support, not tell others what to do in Uganda, but support the same struggles that are happening there. I've worked on these countries, and I know how difficult it is to fight some of those issues. In Afghanistan, under the Taliban, we tried very hard as women's organisations and international movements to get anybody to pay attention. We wore full blue burqas at the UN during the 2000 big meeting on women's rights, but nobody listened. Nobody listened. Doesn't mean they don't talk about women's rights in the US and the UK, but those women didn't matter until something else happened in Afghanistan that offended the West. I don't think these things automatically fall into place. They're different struggles and they have to be linked. What was the other one? I don't know what's going to happen in Scotland. What's it going to mean? I suppose I have to preface it by saying, of course, it's absolutely and completely the decision of people in Scotland as to where they go. I personally would feel that it will become an international conversation. As we were just whispering to each other, how does it fit into internationalism? I mean, if they're a separate nation, then we have to talk about our relationships with them and where they sit in the world and how they position themselves, which at the moment is linked to who we are and how we operate together. And my really big worry, well, there's two big worries for me in terms of Scotland. One is that the massive constitutional change that's on the cards, or at least potentially on the cards this week, has not been done in accord with the sorts of constitutional changes that happen normally and everywhere else, including here and in other countries, which is a 2/3 majority. It's very odd, it seems to me, that a simple majority can make such a massive constitutional shift, so I think that's quite interesting. Secondly, the debate seems to have shifted now into getting rid of the Tories, and so a referendum is being equated with an election. We didn't put the Tories in either. We're stuck with them until we change at the next election, hopefully. And so I think that's a slight problem, that a constitutional shift is being negotiated in the name of getting rid of the government, and that's become very messy and unclear. Sunny, peace envoy in the Middle East. Well, let's say, having worked in the Middle East, it's a bit of a surprise that happened. And there's not a great deal of earth moving that it hasn't delivered peace for the quartet. I mean, it's acting for the quartet. It's clearly not doing the job. It's not. The Norway process has fallen apart. The Oslo process has fallen apart, and the cauldron in the Middle East hasn't been put out, because that needs to happen locally with external support rather than externally with internal acquiescence, and we haven't got there yet.